Welcome to mixing a band. Continuing our driver's ed analogy, here is where we'll hit the road and you'll sit next to me as I drive so you can see everything we've learned so far put into practice. I'm using a simple, straightforward, and affordable like $500 audio console for this, and it's almost completely as you'd find it out of the box. All I did was name the channels. We're going to simulate a sound check for a standard size band exactly as I'd go through the process if they were on stage in front of me. Let's start with the kick. So as I bring it up, I'm looking to see if the fader's metering at a good spot, which it is. I might bring it up a little bit. On here, it's going to be adjusting the trim because of the way that we're routing the audio, but typically this would be gain. Great, and once I'm at a good volume, I'm going to move over to the gate for the kick. First thing I'm going to do is adjust this threshold. So you're going to see I'm adjusting the point at which the gate closes. And then over here on the gain reduction, we're going to see when the gate is closing. Now the gate is starting to close in between kicks and I can hear what it's doing. Now it's not bad, so let me show you though what it would sound like if I had these settings adjusted differently. So remember, the attack is how quickly the gate opens, the hold is how long the gate is open, and the release is how quickly the gate shuts. So if I had a really tight gate, so I had the hold really short and the release really short, see how distorted that sounds? It's because it's not allowing enough of the kick actual sound. We can't hear the full sound that the kick is making. So let me adjust the hold and the release. And now you can hear that the entire kick sound is coming through. And yes, we're gonna have a little bit of bleed from the other instruments and stuff, but as we bring in the rest of the drum kit, we'll see that some of that starts to disappear because you're actually hearing those inputs as well alongside it. So I'm gonna adjust the threshold to just kind of confirm where the kick sound is coming through and make sure that I'm having enough room so that if they do a slightly quieter kick hit, that it still comes through, but also making sure that I'm cutting out as much of the sound in between as I can. And then let's hear it with and without the gate. So the kick without the gate. So you'll hear everything in between, and let me turn on the gate again. See how much tighter that is. So now that we've got the sound tightened up a little bit with the gate, let's move over to the EQ. The first thing I'm noticing, and this is very common on kick drums, is there's some muddiness in kind of the low mids area. So what that sounds like is this. Let me emphasize it for us. And I'll adjust the width of our EQ band so we can hear it. Do you hear that? So this is without it. And this is that section that I'm wanting to take out. So now even just with that small EQ adjustment, you can see that we've shaped the sound a little bit. Like we talked about earlier, the EQ is to shape the sound. And so now it already sounds more like a kick drum with just that one EQ band. So even just with that one EQ band, let me show you. This is with it on, and then this is without the EQ band. And then with the EQ band on. So the next thing I'm noticing is there's a little bit of maybe flappiness is what I would say. And so let me see where I can find what that is and emphasize it so that I can cut it a little bit later. Let me adjust the width a little bit to just cut out the part that I'm hearing. It's almost like a basketball bouncing. And so that's the part that I don't really want, that flappiness. It's not really helpful for the kick sound. So let me pull that out. And I'm gonna adjust the amount that I'm pulling out as I'm hearing it, pulling it out. Awesome. Something to keep in mind is the fundamentals of the kick. So the main part that I want to hear on the kick is that low end, that part that you kind of feel, and then the attack. So the beater, when the beater hits the kick drum, it produces this higher end attack sound. So listen to this. So that's the sound of the beater hitting the drum. And so that'll cut through the mix. So if we have that low end and we have that beater, it's gonna sit in a good spot and it'll always be audible, but not be too in the way of the rest of our mix. So let me boost that, kind of figure out where that beater is hitting and see if I wanna add a little bit of that. Okay, we'll sit that there now. And of course, once we have the whole mix together, we may decide we want a little bit less of that, a little bit more of that. The last place that I mentioned just a second ago is the low end. So let's figure out where the fundamental of kind of that low end of this kick drum is coming in at. And I want to do a little bit of a smaller width for this, just so I can figure out exactly where that low end is coming from. So with this kick drum, that's the range. So this is at about 70 hertz. So usually it'll be in the like maybe 60 to 90 hertz range. And so you kind of just want to find that. And then I'm going to give that a little boost just to help bring a little bit more low end to the kick drum. So now that we have our EQ set, let's listen to this kick drum with EQ and without the EQ. So this is with the EQ. This is without the EQ. And this is with the EQ. Do you see how much tighter it feels? It sounds more like a kick drum. We've taken out some of the things that were in the way and shaped the sound to sound more like the kick drum we want to hear. Just like if you were standing next to the kick drum, this sounds more accurately to what it would sound like. So with the EQ in place, let's move on to the dynamics, which is the compression. Now this is just going to help us keep the kick in control. Of course, drummers get a little bit excited at different points in the song, so we want to help them keep their kick in a pretty good spot in the mix and not be jumping up and down. So I'm going to start with adjusting the threshold, and we'll see it starting to affect the sound. You see the gain reduction, you can see how much it's doing. I want to kind of find a balance between, maybe I can hear when they're doing the harder kicks and the softer kicks and find something that's helping shape the biggest kick drums and when they're the most energetic, but also not doing too much on the quiet parts. And I'm going with my pretty standard settings over here, a 5 on the attack, 10 on the hold, 185 on the release. And then the ratio that I'm using is going to be a little bit higher for the kick because, like I said, it's more of a dynamic instrument. And you're seeing how much the gain reduction is doing. Notice how it's doing more when he's hitting the kick harder and less when he's hitting the kick quieter, but it's helping balance him out overall. So let's listen with and without the compressor. So this is with the compressor on. This is with the compressor off. With the compressor on. Notice how it's not changing the sound very much, but it's helping it be a little bit tighter. It's kind of helping blend everything together. Okay, let's move on to the snare. Now for a snare, I prefer to mic it with a snare top mic and a snare bottom mic. The snare top mic, I like to get the depth, the weight, the hits, and the attack kind of from the stick. And the bottom, you still get some of that sizzle from the snares themselves, those wires underneath. So between the two mics, you get both of them. Before I jump into anything else, for the snare bottom, I'll usually use the polarity inversion. Because these two mics are pointed at the same thing, it's one of the few places where you want to invert the phase. And so you can see it's this circle with a line through it on the snare bottom. So I'll start with that turned on, and that'll help clean up our sound. Beginning with the snare top mic. Now this is just a standard SM57, your very common mic sitting on top. So let's bring up the fader, and just like before, we're gonna listen and see where our sound is hitting, and then also watch to see where our meter is hitting. All right, our meter's in a good spot. It's not clipping or anything, so I won't need to adjust the gain for that one. And we're gonna jump straight into EQ, which is the first thing that I'll adjust on the snare. The first thing I wanna do, even before I start listening more critically to the snare, is look at adding a low cut. So I'm gonna change this one to a low cut here. Now you can see, this is gonna help it stay out of too far into the subs. And then over time, I'll have this on a lot of inputs to help keep our low end nice and tight. So I'm gonna pull this up. Now if I do too much of the low cut, it doesn't sound like a snare anymore. So I'm gonna place that there. And the next thing that I'm hearing is some muddiness. So let me see if I can figure out where that's coming from. And I'm gonna adjust the width because it's kind of a section, it feels like, of sound. And that's where I'm hearing it, so I'm gonna cut it out. Now I'm hearing something that's kind of ringing. It's very subtle, so I'm gonna go with a very small width. See, I'm gonna adjust the width very small. And let me try and find that. I know it's in the low end, but I don't know exactly where it is. Hear that? It almost sounds like if I were in a room and through speakers, you'd probably hear it starting to feed back. It's so resonant right there. So that's what I wanna cut out. And again, I don't want to lose any of the other sound around there that sounds good, so I'm using a pretty small width for that. So now I feel good about this EQ. I'm not having to do much. This is just a normal microphone on a normal snare, and it doesn't always take a lot, and so I'm not fearful of having just a little bit of EQ. So listen as I turn this EQ on and off, and you're gonna hear how we've shaped the sound of the snare top mic and also removed some of the rumble that we may be hearing from kick or things around it. So we're shaping the sound of the mic to make the snare sound as clean and as normal and natural as possible. So this is with the EQ on. This is with it off. And this is with it back on. So now I'm feeling good about that snare sound, so let's move over to the compressor. I'm gonna start by adjusting this threshold again. And reminder that my ratio is at about 5. That's because the snare, it sounds good when it's a little bit compressed. And so that's where I'm gonna start with the ratio, and it's gonna do a little bit more compression than maybe some of my other inputs. So I'm adjusting this threshold so that every time that the drummer hits the snare, it's using some compression and helping keep it contained. And over here I have my attack, hold, and release set to my pretty standard settings. I don't think I'll need to adjust much on that. Okay, now that I feel good about the snare, it's time to move on to the snare bottom mic. And I'm gonna listen to this one individually because I wanna hear the snare top by itself, then the snare bottom by itself, and then I'll put the two mics together and hear them together and hear how they sound. So it's still the drummer on stage, just hitting the snare one hit at a time. Let me bring up the snare bottom. Once I feel good about gain and the metering there, I'm gonna move over to our EQ. And I'm gonna start again with this low cut. I may go a little bit higher for the snare bottom because I like the thud of that snare top mic, but I don't know that I necessarily need as much of that from the snare bottom here. I'm mostly listening for that kind of rattle that we're hearing. And in a very similar fashion to the snare top, there's some of that muddiness. It doesn't quite sound right. It's not really crucial for this. And so I'm gonna boost that, adjust the width a little bit. Another way you may hear it called is boxy. It sounds a little bit boxy. Once I've emphasized that, I'm gonna take that out. Even just that is much better. It doesn't take much, but it's helping a ton. And sometimes, depending on the snare, I may wanna cut a little bit of something up here. So let's hear. I think it'll help shape it up a little bit if I pull some of this out. So already that's sounding a lot cleaner, a lot tighter. So this is with the EQ on. This is with it off. This is with it back on. Great, and so now we'll move over to the compressor. Same thing as the snare top, we're gonna use a decent bit of compression on this, and we're at that ratio of 5 as well. So let me bring in the threshold. So now we're gonna start seeing the gain reduction happening, and it's gonna be coming in. Okay, now that we feel good about the snare top and the snare bottom, it's time to hear them together. And this may change how we adjust some of our EQs or things like that once we hear them in context with one another. And you'll notice that I typically have the snare top a decent bit louder than the snare bottom. The snare bottom's helping bring in that rattle, but the snare top is really driving the snare sound. Now, as I'm listening to them together, I'm hearing that that kind of low sound that we heard earlier on the snare top is still there. So I'm gonna try taking that out a little bit more. See if I can hone in on that exact frequency. Maybe pull it out a little bit deeper. And I'm gonna keep that in the back of my mind as I go on to the other things. And once I hear the drum kit all together, if I'm hearing that again, I know exactly where to find it. So now I feel great about the snare, and let's move on to the tom. So this is tom 1, also called the rack tom, which is gonna be a little bit higher pitched maybe, is how we would describe it. So let's bring it in. Now this is pretty common with tom mics. You're gonna hear a decent bit of bleed. So we'll have to navigate the gate a little bit discerningly. The gain's at a good level, it's not clipping, it's not too low, so let's jump into our gate. Let me turn it on and start to bring in the gate. And you're gonna start to see the gain reduction happen as the gate closes. Now to me, the speed at which the gate is shutting is a little bit long. I don't think it needs to be that long. It can still sound natural without being that long. So I'm gonna start to close in the gate, make the hold a little bit shorter so it doesn't stay open as long, and the release a little bit faster. Remember our analogy from earlier with the door shutting? I'm gonna let the door shut a little bit quicker. Now if I did too short, it doesn't sound like a tom anymore. So we wanna be careful not to go too far, so let me open it up a little bit more. Now I found a good balance of retaining how the tom sounds, but also letting the gate close so that I'm getting rid of those unwanted sounds in between. Let's see, let's double check our threshold. Make sure we're not missing any of the tom hits that are quieter or things like that. And of course, in person, you'll see when your drummer is hitting the toms, so you'll be able to also notice, oh, wait a minute, my gate is too tight because I'm not hearing that sound come through as they're hitting the tom. Okay, now that I feel good about the gate, let's move on to the EQ. Now again, we'll start with our low cut, and let me turn on our real-time analyzer, the RTA, so we can kind of see how it's getting information that's super low. I don't really need any of that sound that's down here in the 40 hertz or this super, super low end stuff for my tom. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut that out. And then the next thing, very, very often on toms, I would say almost always, I'm gonna be cutting out some of that mid-range area. And so we're gonna hear that here in a second. As I boost it, let me make the width a little bit higher so we can hear that. Yeah, do you hear that? Yeah, that's not something we wanna hear. So watch as I cut it out how much cleaner the tom will sound. And don't get freaked out by how the gate opening closes sounds. Once we have everything together, all of our drums together, we'll be able to tell if there's anything weird. Because think about our overheads won't be gated, and so they'll fill in that gap in between these tom hits. So really, we just want to hear the tom when the tom gate opens. Now the next thing I'm hearing is a little bit of hollowness maybe, and so let's see if we can find that. I think it's right there, so I'm gonna pull some of that out. Now, if you need to, the attack of the tom, so let's say like when the stick hits the tom, kind of that sound of that. So let's hear what that sounds like. Hear this. So this is the other area that I'll often adjust on a tom. And I may need to boost it a little bit if I'm not hearing the toms come through, or I may need to cut it back a little bit if I'm hearing way too much of that stick. For now, we'll leave it there, but we know where to find it if we need it as the rest of the mix comes together. So let's listen to this tom 1 mic, the rack tom, with and without EQ. So this is with the EQ on. This is with the EQ off. This is with the EQ back on. Great, let's move over to compression. And so we're gonna have our pretty standard compression settings. Our ratio is gonna be set at 3. And let me bring in the threshold a little bit and you'll start to see it reducing the gain, which is just compressing the sound. And there we have our tom sound. You'll notice a little bit of bleed in between each of those tom hits, and maybe you can hear the vocal coming through, you can hear one of the cymbals. That's okay. I would rather have a little bit of that than to be cutting out the sound and have it gated too tight to where when they're hitting the tom, we can't hear it at all. So it's a little bit of a balance. And with tom 1 complete, let's move over to tom 2. This is gonna be the deeper of our toms. With our gain set where we want it to be, we can jump into the gate section. I'm gonna start by bringing up this threshold. Now our attack, hold, and release are gonna be pretty similar to our tom 1, but let's hear what it's doing. Now if I do too much, you'll notice when I release it that you're gonna hear all the tom hits in between that I was cutting out. Hear that? That's why we have to be really careful with the tom 2 gate, because there's all these quieter hits in between, and oftentimes drummers will use the floor tom for quieter moments or for things during announcements or some background things as well. And so we're gonna be very conservative with our tom 2 gate. Notice how it's not even shutting, but I'm still gonna set it at a level to which whenever something else is going on or he's staying very far away from the tom 2, it'll close that gate. This part of the song has almost constant tom hits, and so we won't see the gate shut very often, and that's okay. Let's move over to the EQ section. We'll start again with our low cut, so let me set this. And remember, if we have the low cut too high, it's gonna cut out too much, so we just wanna set it. Our floor tom again is deeper, and so we will wanna have maybe a little bit more low end in there. The first thing I'm hearing is that same muddiness as the tom 1 mic, and so let's boost that, let's adjust the width a little bit, kind of see where that's coming from. And then we'll cut that out. Now next I'm hearing something kind of flappy, kind of similar to our other tom mic. Let's see if we can find that. Maybe adjust the width down, and then pull that out. And then again, the attack of this tom is gonna be up here. You can hear the stick. I think it's at a good spot right now, but we'll keep an eye on it and come back to that EQ band if we need it later. So let's move over to our dynamics with our compressor and keep this tom under control a little bit. As I bring down the threshold, you'll see the gain reduction begin, just to help keep him in control a little bit. So now I feel good about this tom 2 mic. Just for fun, let's listen to what it sounds like with the gate, compression, and EQ all off. So I'm gonna turn all 3 of those off so you can hear it. So this is just the raw signal. That's the raw sound we're getting, and then once I turn on our gate, our EQ, and our compressor, now we hear the finalized sound. Notice how we've cleaned up the sound with the EQ and with the gate, and then we've also helped keep it in control with our compressor. Okay, we're cruising now, so now we're on to the hi-hat mic. So let's bring that in. I'm gonna gain this down a little bit because it's not something that's a super high feature in my mix. Just wanna be able to have that in a good spot. Okay, and then I won't need a gate for this, so let me just jump right into EQ, and I'm gonna start with our low cut. Here, I'm gonna go a little bit higher because I don't really need any of the low end from the hi-hat. And the only thing that I'm hearing EQ-wise really is I'm gonna get the width a little bit higher, but it's kind of this, we'll hear it. Some of that just lowness on whenever the hi-hats are hit, that kind of low mid area. I'm gonna clean that up just a little bit, and then I feel good about it. I don't have to do a ton of work on the hi-hats typically. So then I can jump over to our compressor and get ready to bring in our compression. And I'm gonna wait until there's a hi-hat hit to be able to see it. Great. So now I feel good about the hi-hat. I can move on. Let's take a look at our overhead mics. So here I have an overhead left and an overhead right. Each of them spaced a pretty equal distance from the snare to help make sure all the phasing is coming into the right place, but generally covering different parts of the drum kit. Let's hear what it sounds like with just the mics. So you're hearing that ride, and you're also hearing the crash coming around it. Now in between both of those, you're obviously hearing the entire drum kit as well, because these are pointed at the whole kit and they're gonna pick up a lot of things. And so really these are filling in the gaps in between all the individual mics and helping us get some of those cymbals in there as well. So let's start with EQ. I'm gonna do a low cut. Here I'm gonna be a little bit more aggressive with the low cut again, because I really don't need the kick, I don't need anything, any of that low end information. I really just want those cymbals mostly. But I still want it to sound natural, so let me back it back a little bit. Great, and then I'm gonna do similar to the hi-hat probably, and get a nice wide band to cut out some of that low mids. I don't necessarily wanna cut it out completely with the low cut, but I do wanna reduce it a little bit. Okay, let's listen to the overheads with the EQ, and then without the EQ. With the EQ. You're probably noticing that the main things that we hear that are different is that we no longer hear the kick low end, we no longer hear the bass low end, so it's really shaping up the sound to just try and keep as much of just the cymbals in these mics. So then we'll move over to compression. This I do a slightly higher ratio, usually either 4 or 5, just to do a little bit more compression, maybe a slightly slower attack, just to make it sound a little bit more natural. So let's bring in our threshold. And this compressor is going to help keep our cymbals and the overhead mics under control. Now this is the fun part. We're going to take all of those inputs that we've each made sound good on their own, and we're going to put them all together. So here's where I would ask the drummer, hey, could you play the full kit? Just play a groove, play something from one of the songs. And then I'm going to bring in all the mics together. So I'm noticing a lot of cymbals, and so I'm kind of listening for where that might be coming through as I'm bringing in each of these. So before I even get to the overhead mics, I actually already have a decent amount of cymbals. And that's important to note because there will be times, depending on the room or the context, that you don't actually need much hi-hat or much cymbals in your mix, because coming off of the stage, the sound is already pretty loud. So don't be afraid to mix with your overheads all the way at 0 if that's the context and that's the situation that works best for you. For this, I'll bring them in a little bit because it's a closed environment, so we can have a little bit more of them. And I'm listening to everything together and making adjustments as we go. And this is usually the part at which I'm not only adjusting the faders, but I'm also thinking about tonally, where's everything sitting, and are there any EQ changes I need to make as well. One thing I'm noticing now that all the drums are in here together is that I'm not hearing the kick attack as much. Remember that beater? So I'm gonna go over to the kick, go over to our EQ, and maybe just boost this a little bit more. Because I'm feeling the low end, I'm feeling the kick, but I'm not hearing it as much from that beater, and so I just wanna add a little bit more of that now that I'm hearing it in context with everything else. The other thing that I'm noticing is I'm hearing a lot of cymbals, and so I'm gonna try and figure out where that's coming from. I think it might be these tom mics, so let me try this, pulling these out. And yeah, you can hear that it all went away. So what that tells me is I may need to make an EQ adjustment on the toms, and I may need to gate them a little bit tighter, or I may just need to have them a little bit lower in the mix. So let me start with tom 2, and I'm actually gonna do a nice wide EQ here and just pull that down just a little bit. I don't want to do too much to where it affects the tom, but I just want to kind of keep the cymbals in balance a little bit and keep them from overtaking everything else. And let me hear tom 1. I think I'm going to do the same thing here. You can hear what I'm emphasizing. A lot of the cymbals are coming through. And some of that will be unavoidable, but maybe I can just help a little bit here. And then I'll bring in both those tom mics back in, now that our cymbals are a little bit more in control, hopefully. What I'm noticing is you can tell very clearly when the gate is opening and shutting on tom 1, and you also are hearing a lot of cymbals through it. So let me emphasize the tom 1. And I'm gonna take out this, that kind of whooshy cymbal sound. And it's not gonna change everything, but it's gonna help a little bit. And then let me go over to the gate, and maybe just extend the release a little bit so it's not as aggressive whenever it's shutting. Down a little bit. Okay, I feel much better about that. And the last thing we're gonna do to help shape all of our drums together is we're gonna look at our panning. So the instruments or the drums that I will always pan are the toms. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky because it depends on your room. You wanna make sure you're not panning too aggressively, especially if the majority of your room is only hearing out of one set of speakers, either the left or right. And so I'm gonna do just a little bit here. I'm gonna take our tom 1 here and pan it left just a little bit, maybe like 10 to the left. I'm gonna take our tom 2 and go to the right just a little bit, maybe about the same amount. And then I'm gonna take our overheads and do kind of something I might do like 15, so a little bit more. But I don't wanna do too much. One thing to note, you wanna pan your toms in the same direction that the overheads are panned. So if your overhead is on the left side over here, you want your tom 1 panned to the same side. That way you're not hearing it through the other mic and it's kind of creating this weird circular effect. So now that's widened our drums just a little bit. Of course, again, in a room, it's not gonna do as much, and so we're just being very subtle with that panning, but I think that'll help space out our drums a little bit. And lastly, you'll notice that the fundamentals of our drums, the most important things are the kick and the snare. That's what's kind of driving the consistency. And so I'm really spending a lot of my thought and my attention on the kick and the snare to make sure that those are present, because those are gonna drive the mix as we get into adding the other instruments. Just for fun, let's listen to all of the drums together, but without any of the processing that we've done so far today. So this is just the inputs, just the mics by themselves turned up. And now this is with all the processing on that we've done today. The fader's in the same spot as the unprocessed version. Okay, that was a lot. Take a deep breath, and we'll see you in the next video when we start talking about bass.